Hi Year 9s, I hope you're all doing well. What I'm going to start with today is just letting you know kind of where we're up to in the course and giving you a sense of what we've got to come as well. Now, so far we've actually done 3 weeks of work on the Kaiser's Germany, and this week is going to be your last week looking at Kaiser Wilhelm II. So you should already have notes on how Germany was run under the Kaiser and what the Kaiser was like. That's the work that we did in week 1. Then in week 2, we looked at industrialisation, the rise of socialism, and generally the problems that the Kaiser experienced. And then finally, last week, you looked at the Kaiser's foreign policy and what he did to cause World War I, including something called Weltpolitik and the naval laws. Now this week, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be spending 2 hours doing history work as always. The first hour is going to be all about the impact of World War I on the German people. And then once we've done that, in the second hour this week, we're going to be doing some revision of the Kaiser's Germany. Now that means that next week we're then going to move on to a new unit within the Germany topic, looking at something called the Weimar Republic. So make sure you've got all those notes completed, as I'm sure you already have done. I'm sure you recognise this slide already. We have it on every PowerPoint, but this is the general instructions. So first of all of the tasks that I'm going to do today will be in a yellow, kind of yellowy orange box. So make sure you're looking out for those. Obviously, every slide should be narrated. If you can hear me now, then it's obviously working, but I've just put on there about the YouTube link in case you do struggle with trying to get access to the narrated PowerPoints. And the really key thing is about the webinar. Now, you only have to join the webinar if you've got questions. So during that webinar, it's essentially me speaking for a couple of minutes. I say way less than I do when I talk about the work on these PowerPoints. And then I just sit around waiting to see if anybody's got any questions. So don't feel like you've got to log on unless you want to ask me something. You're not going to miss out on anything apart from if people ask me any questions. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so to begin with, what we'd like you to do is to try and see how much you can remember from last week's work. Now, there's 2 sets of questions I'm going to ask you about. One is Weltpolitik, and there's 5 questions on that, and the other is there are 6 questions on the naval laws and the naval race. Now, what I'd like you to do is to pause this video in a second and have a go at writing down the answers on a scrap piece of paper to see what you can remember from last week. If you're not quite sure, still have a go and write it down, and then you can check my answers afterwards. What I do is I pause the video now so that you have time to do it. So what I'm going to do now is just go through the answers really quickly on the key questions. So first of all, I asked you to define Weltpolitik. Remember, this is the Kaiser's aggressive foreign policy. We were looking at that last week. Number 2, in what continent did the Kaiser want to build up the German Empire? The answer was Africa. Remember, the scramble for Africa was going on at this point. Number 3, what did people say about the British Empire? That the sun never set on it because it was so large. Number 4, where did the Germans successfully colonise? So where did they manage to take over? Well, the Kaiser Wilhelm II, who we're looking at, his dad had taken over Kaiser Wilhelm Land, which is modern-day Papua New Guinea, near Australia. But the current Kaiser that we're studying took over Togo, Cameroon and Southwest Africa, which is nowadays called Namibia. Number 5, how did Weltpolitik affect Germany's relationship with England and France? What created massive tensions between them and led to the French and the British creating an alliance called the Entente Cordiale in 1904. The next set of answers for the naval laws and naval race. How many naval laws were there? There were 5. If you put 3, that's fine because that's what you studied last week. You looked at 3 different ones. Number 2, who was the German admiral that encouraged the Kaiser to build up his navy? It was von Tirpitz. Number 3, why did Germany need a bigger navy? There's so many answers you could have for this one. You could have talked about for status and power, jealousy over Britain's empire, or you could have talked about the fact that he needed it to create or defend his new empire. Number 4, how did the naval laws affect Germany's relationship with Britain? Caused massive tension. Really well done if you mentioned something about the 2-power standard and how Britain really cared about their navy. Number 5, what did Britain build in 1906 and how did that affect the German naval race? You want to have something down about the dreadnought and the fact that it then became a race to try and build dreadnoughts. And the final question, who won the Anglo-German naval race? It was Britain because they won with 29 dreadnoughts to Germany's 17. Okay, let's move on to the actual work for today. So ideally we need to put this on our lined paper, but if you don't have any lined paper, then just put it in your normal exercise book. So the title for today is In What Ways Did the First World War Affect Germany? So we're going to be looking to be able to describe and maybe even explain those different problems, and then also think about which ones would be the worst for the Germans. So as you can tell from the title, we're going to be thinking about what impact the First World War had on Germany. Now, one of the big impacts that we're going to be looking at is something called the British naval blockade. And we're going to be thinking about how did that affect German civilians. Now, this is really important because it's one of the reasons why Germany lost the First World War. And to be honest, it's the main reason. It wasn't like they were losing on all the battlefields. It was really crucial that they couldn't access their supplies. Now, at this point, just like today, people didn't grow all of their own food. So the food that the Germans needed didn't just come from Germany. It came from lots of different countries, and it would be shipped in from various directions into Germany itself. Now, the British, who we know had the most superior navy in the world, used their navy to try and blockade German ports. Essentially, they're trying to stop those merchant ships from delivering goods to Germany. Now, what I want you to do when you look at this map is to think about the answers for two questions. You don't have to write it down unless you want to, but you'll need to pause it and then have a really good think about, first of all, why would Germany be so easy to blockade? And second of all, what effects do you think it would have on Germany and the Germans to have all of these merchant ships stopped that were bringing food into Germany? So have a little think about it, just pause the video and then we'll see what kind of points you could have had on the next slide. You've had a little think about it and you've thought about those two questions about why was Germany easy to blockade and what would be the effects. Now what I'd like you to do is to listen as I talk through this information and then to make some notes under a subheading of why did Germany lose World War I, so put that as a subheading and then make these notes here. So Germany was landlocked apart from their access to the North Sea. So we can see obviously that they've got countries next to them here with Poland. We've also got the Czech Republic, what was called Czechoslovakia at that point there as well. And we've also got obviously places like Belgium and France. So their only access to the sea is in the North Sea. And obviously we mentioned already that Britain basically patrolled the North Sea very successfully. Now, at this point in World War I, there was lots of submarine warfare, and from 1916, both countries, Germany and Britain, had tried to be starving the other person out. So Germany sank lots of merchant ships bringing food into our country, and Britain sank lots of merchant ships bringing food into Germany. Unfortunately for Germany, Britain were more successful, and their aim was to try and starve Germany into submission. And to be honest, it was very successful. Now, this is horrendous, but 400,000 German civilians died as a result of this blockade. Some of them from actual starvation, others of them died from illnesses that are linked to malnutrition and the poor conditions that they faced as a result of the lack of food. So this essentially put pressure on the German government to end the First World War because you can't keep fighting a war if your own country has been affected this badly. So it puts pressure on the civilians to then put pressure on their government to then end the First World War. So the naval blockade is very important. Now we're moving on to the main bit of the lesson, which is trying to get some good notes on the social, political and economic impact of the First World War. Now to do this, I'd suggest you do it as a spider diagram, like this one that I've drawn on the left. But if you don't feel like you can do it very neatly, or you struggle with, formatting it, you can do it just as subheadings with notes bullet pointed underneath. Now to find the information, you're going to need to look at the next 3 slides. The next slide talks about the social impact and gives you the bullet points that you can copy down or make notes from. And the slide after has about the economic impact, and again, bullet points, those points underneath. And then the next slide afterwards has about the political impact. Now that one, just so you know, you will need the biggest amount of space for because it's got the most bullet points that you'll need to take notes on. Okay, so start formatting your spider diagrams or your notes. So on this slide here, we've got the information that you're going to use for your social impact leg of your spider diagram. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk through the information and then you need to make some notes on it on your spider diagrams. So first of all, the war had deepened divisions in German society. There were huge gaps between the living standards of the rich and the poor. Now, even if we're thinking about it just in terms of food, remember that when there's the naval blockade, there's not enough food going into Germany for everyone. That means the price of it goes up, and wealthy people can still afford food, but a lot of poor people couldn't. So enormous social impact where there's even deeper divisions in German society between the rich and the poor. There were also a lot of working class people that were really upset about the fact that there were restrictions placed on their earnings during the war. However, even though they're being told you've got to accept lower wages because it's for the good of Germany, we can't afford to pay you more, we need to make sure that, we're prioritising spending money for the war effort rather than giving it to individual people. At the same time, lots of German workers saw that factory owners were actually making a lot of profit from the war, and they felt that was really unfair that they were having to work these extra long hours for no extra money, and yet all of a sudden they found that other people were actually benefiting from the war, and that made a lot of people very angry. Another big social impact of the war that happens in Britain as well as Germany is that more and more women are being called to work in the factories. Now, as millions of men are having to go and fight for their nations, they need women to step up and go and work in the factories to make the weapons that they're fighting with. Now, that causes some real tension because there's a lot of people that see that as damaging to traditional family values and society. So there's this kind of tension between what the economy needs of women working and actually what some German people want to happen and whether they want women to stay in their kind of traditional role or not. Now, not only that, we've also got obviously the human cost of the First World War, which is enormous. Now, you might remember from when we did the unit on conflict and tension that 2 million German soldiers had died. That's in comparison to 1.4 million French and 750,000 British soldiers that had died. Now, not only that, but they also have an enormous human cost when it comes to civilians, certainly much more than Britain and France. So 400,000 German civilians had died from the naval blockade. So there's an enormous social cost to the war. And when people return from the war, the Germany that they come back to is not necessarily the Germany that they left. They found that loved ones maybe have passed away, that, factory workers have changed. Now women are working in those factories. So the war has an enormous social impact and changes Germany very drastically. Moving on to your next leg of your spider diagram on the economic impact. Now, as a result of the war, Germany virtually became bankrupt. Now, that's not surprising because you might remember me mentioning in last week's PowerPoint about the fact that they had borrowed so much money to fund things like their naval expansion. Now, as a result of the war and the fact that they actually borrowed 84% of what they spent on the First World War, they had a debt of 1.44 billion marks. So they're already in trouble even before things like reparations are added on top. To make things worse, to then pay off their debts, they needed to make sure that they were producing lots of goods and selling lots of goods and that factories were paying lots of taxes. However, national income and the amount of money that Germany actually got was about a third of what it had been before the war. Industrial production as well was only 2/3 of what it had been before the First World War. Now, what that means is that government's really going to struggle to be able to pay off their debts because they're not getting very much money in from things like taxes. So they've got to all of a sudden pay off their debts and pay some extra money that I'll talk about in a second, when actually they're not getting as much money and they're not generating as much money as normal. So I mentioned that they have to pay other things. Now, as a result of the war, have to pay pensions for 600,000 widows. So each of those women had lost a husband in the First World War. There's 2 million German children without fathers now, and the government has a duty to pay them some money to kind of basically help them out now that they've lost that financial security of their husbands. And by 1925, the state was spending about 1/3 of its budget. 1/3 of all of the money within Germany was going on war pensions for either those ex-soldiers or their widows. So Germany's got to pay all of this money out and pay off all these big debts when actually they don't have very much income coming in. So they were essentially bankrupt. Final section of your spider diagrams is going to be on the political impact. I'm going to talk through this now. Now, to begin with, what we need to understand is that Germany was run by the Kaiser before the First World War. He was the most powerful, and he really relied on a select group of advisors, other people that were in the top levels of the army and the judiciary, things like that. Now, he actually, during the First World War, gave a lot of power to two top German generals, a man called General Hindenburg and also a man called General Ludendorff. Now, these people had been running Germany essentially since 1917, but by the time it gets to September 1980, they realise that they're going to lose the war. There's no way that Germany can win. The naval blockade is starving German civilians. They're in a really tight spot, and they know that there's no way they can turn it round. Now, those top generals don't want to admit that they've caused problems and that actually they're responsible for the loss of the First World War. So they basically cheat the system a little bit, and they technically hand over lots of power to the Reichstag, which remember is the German parliament. That's existed for a long time, but it's never had any power before. Now, the Reichstag also realise that there's no way they are going to be able to win the war, and they're concerned with trying to get the best peace terms for Germany. So Reichstag deputies, people that work in the Reichstag, MPs, end up asking the Allies, and specifically President Wilson of the USA, for peace. They know they can't win the war. They're looking to try and get the best peace deal possible. Now, when rumours start about this and German civilians hear actually their government, this new Reichstag government, has asked for peace, it makes people very angry. Remember, they've suffered through things like the naval blockade for about 2 years now. And all of a sudden they think, what's this weak new government doing asking for peace? Propaganda had told them this whole way through that they were winning, and so they were very shocked and angry and confused at the idea of the loss of war. And this led to a revolution. Now, this revolution that Germany experienced started with something called the mutinies, and it started somewhere called Wilhelmshaven, and it spread to the main naval base at somewhere called Kiel. And what a mutiny is when you refuse to listen to your commander. So let's say you're a unit in the Navy and you refuse to do what the admiral or the leader of the ship is telling you to do. So it started with soldiers basically revolting and refusing to fight when they were told to fight, and it ended with the abdication of the Kaiser. So the political impact of the First World War in Germany is absolutely enormous. They go from having the Kaiser as their leader, and they end up getting rid of him, because that's what abdication means. It means when he gives up the throne. And they end up creating a new republic. So this is an enormous impact. So when it talks here about Germany become a democratic republic, what we mean by the word republic is a country without a monarch, without a king or queen. And they essentially got rid of the Kaiser, and then they didn't have a king afterwards. They ended up being much more democratic, where they voted in a president, and they also had the Reichstag being more powerful. Now we're going to see all about this new democratic republic over the next few weeks. And we're going to see that actually they were hated right from the start, because the very first thing this new government did was end the First World War and sign the armistice. This new government was created on the 9th of November 1918, and the war was ended on the 11th of November 1918. And lots of ex-soldiers, lots of civilians ended up despising the new government because they felt that people like General Hindenburg and General Ludendorff had been betrayed by weak politicians that ended the war without their consent. Now, don't worry if that's a little bit confusing at the moment, because we're going to spend next week looking at that in more detail, and it will become more clear as time goes on. What I'd like you to do now is again pause the video and make notes on the political impact. On the previous slide, I mentioned about the establishment of the Weimar Republic, this new democratic government. Now, what I'd like you to do is to watch that 2-minute clip. You can either go on it on the hyperlink there or just copy and paste that into your search bar. So watch that 2-minute clip. You don't have to make any notes, but if you want to, you can add them to that political impact section of your spider diagram. And hopefully it will make it a little bit clearer about what happens at the end of the First World War and how this new government is established. Okay, so you've now actually done the first hour's worth of work for history this week, and you've got the final notes that you need on the Kaiser's Germany. Now what we need to do for this second hour is to make sure that we're revising it and we're trying to make it more memorable, because you will need to know the facts and details. Now obviously when we come back in September, we will talk through the Kaiser's Germany with you and we will do some revision work. But what we need you to do now is to make flashcards on the Kaiser, which you're then going to have for the rest of year 10 and 11. And these will be really important. You'll come back to these in the future, so you want to keep these safe. Now, some of you, if you were in on the last week before lockdown, will have given you a whole pack of flashcards. And if you've got those, then please do use them. If you don't happen to have any flashcards at home, please try and make them. Even if you have to make them out of paper, please keep them safe, because you will need them in the future as well. Now, there's going to be 26 questions on this short answer test. Now, what I want you to do is to make sure that your flashcards are as good as possible. So try and make sure that they're easy to revise from. Maybe write a little bit bigger than normal. Don't use your normal handwriting. Some people find that writing in capital letters makes it easier to look at their flashcards and revise from them in the future. You might want to think about using highlighters or different coloured pens to emphasise key words or dates, but try and make them as easy to revise from as possible. Now, once you've made these flashcards, you then need to spend the rest of the hour revising them. You might test yourself, you might get parents to test you if they're not too busy, maybe a sibling, but you want to make sure that you're kind of trying to learn these answers, because next week on Show My Homework, there's going to be a short answer test that's going to be done through the quizzes section on Show My Homework. So it's really important that you make these flashcards now, keep them safe, potentially email us a picture of them when you've done them if you want, if you're really proud of them, and then make sure you're revising them over the next week, ready for a test that will be on Show My Homework next Monday. So as I said, the questions and answers are going to be on Show My Homework, but they're also over the next 2 slides if you prefer to just use this PowerPoint. I'm not going to read through all of these, but you can pause the PowerPoint and then use these to create your flashcards. Remember, put the question on the front, the answer on the back. Now, this has only got the first 13 questions on. You'll need to go on the next slide to be able to do questions 14 to 26. You've got questions 14 to 26 here for you to be able to make your flashcards on. Don't forget that once you finish this, you then need to actually make sure you're revising them, kind of keep going back to them over the next week or so, making sure that you know the answers really well on this, and we will go through it all when we come back in September. So just a final few things to say before we finish the work for this week. So as I mentioned, you don't have to send us any of the work this week, but we would like to see pictures of your flashcards if you want to send them. So you can attach them to Show My Homework, or you can email them to us. Now, as well as the short answer test next week, there is, as always, going to be a quiz to test your understanding of this week's learning on Show My Homework. So it's just going to be a short quiz on the impact of war, so the political, social and economic impact of the First World War. So please do remember to have a go at that. And then remember that if you are stuck with any of this work, you can come onto the webinar at 10 AM on Wednesday and you can ask me questions, but you only need to join that if you've got a question. If you don't have any questions and you found the work all right, then you don't need to log on to that at that time. Okay, thank you very much for doing the work, and I hope it went well.